What if the answer to a 48-year mystery was living just 3 miles from where it all began? What if a case every officer had given up on suddenly woke up? Tonight, we open a story that stretches across generations, a story of a girl who vanished on a warm Mississippi evening, and the truth that refused to stay buried. And before we go any further, I want you to step into this moment with us. Welcome to Cold Case Reopened. Go ahead, drop a comment below with the time and location you're watching from. Are you tuning in late at night, early morning, at home, at work? I'm always curious where in the world these stories reach you. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe and like this video. It helps us bring forward more cases that deserve to be remembered. Now, close your eyes for just a second and picture this: a quiet rural road, the sun dipping below the trees, and a single moment so ordinary that no one realized it would become the last trace of a young girl's life. What happened next would haunt a community for almost half a century. Let's begin. The frost had settled thick across the treetops that January morning, turning the edges of Hancock County into a landscape of muted silver. Inside her small kitchen, Detective Lisa Romano reached for the vibrating phone on the counter, the screen glowing 5 o'clock a.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. Calls at that hour came with a distinct weight, the kind that pressed itself into a person before they even answered. Sheriff Mike Patterson didn't waste time on greetings. His voice carried the gravel of exhaustion and something sharper beneath it. "We got him, Lisa. Robert Sullivan's in custody." 6 words that fractured nearly half a century of waiting. The warrant had been signed only hours earlier, part of an operation that had moved cautiously toward a man who lived a quiet, almost forgettable life outside Meridian. By sunrise, he was already in handcuffs, a 67-year-old construction worker with thinning gray hair and the demeanor of someone who blended easily into the rhythm of small-town Mississippi. Neighbors had long known him as polite, helpful, the kind who offered a nod at the grocery store. None had suspected that he once lived just 3 miles from the Mitchell family farm, carrying a secret that had followed him through every year of his adult life. As news spread through Hancock County, the reaction came in waves. People who had grown up hearing Sarah Mitchell's name in cautionary whispers found themselves startled awake by the realization that the story they believed frozen in the past had suddenly moved again. For decades, the case had been something inherited, an old wound absorbed into community memory. Parents had repeated Sarah's disappearance as a lesson. Teenagers had heard it passed down as a warning, and older residents had carried the quiet ache of not knowing. Now that uncertainty cracked open, stirring emotions that many had long set aside. At the Sheriff's Department, Sullivan sat folded into himself, hands clasped in his lap. He didn't protest. He didn't ask why. After nearly 50 years of silence, he simply faced the moment he had spent most of his life avoiding. The room around him had contained countless confessions and denials, but none with this much history clinging to it, none tied to a case that had outlived investigators, witnesses, and the very era in which it began. Romano stepped into the hallway, letting the cold morning air steady her. The gravity of the arrest didn't come from the man in custody, it came from the years behind him. 48 years, 11 months, 16 days, a span long enough for entire generations to come and go, for the case file to settle into dust-covered corners of courthouse basements, for hope to thin into resignation. But now the silence had finally broken. As Romano prepared to face the man linked to a disappearance older than she was, her thoughts shifted toward the only place they could go next, the beginning. Before warrants, before evidence boxes, before decades of unanswered questions, there was a 16-year-old girl on a blue bicycle riding toward Beaver Creek on a warm June evening in 1976. And to understand what this morning truly meant, the story had to return to the last time Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was seen alive. The heat of a Mississippi evening had begun to settle into its familiar weight as the sun dipped low over County Road 347. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the air carried that dense, humid stillness that belongs only to mid-June. Along the quiet stretch of road, the soft whir of bicycle tires was the only sound cutting through the warm haze. At 6:23 p.m., Mrs. Dorothy Hayes stepped into her garden to water her tomatoes, the same ritual she performed every evening. As she turned toward the road, she caught sight of 16-year-old Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell pedaling her blue Schwinn toward Beaver Creek. Sarah's blonde hair streamed behind her, catching the last bands of daylight. She lifted one hand from the handlebars and gave a cheerful wave, an easy, familiar gesture Mrs. Hayes had seen countless times. It was simple, ordinary, gentle, and it would be the last confirmed moment of Sarah's freedom. Earlier that afternoon, Sarah had left the Mitchell farm with a clear plan: meet her best friend, Jennifer Walsh, at the swimming hole near Beaver Creek. It was a place where teenagers gathered to escape the heat, a routine that marked the start of every summer. Her mother, Margaret Mitchell, had given her the usual reminders: be home before dark, avoid the deeper parts of the creek. Sarah laughed, kissed her mother's cheek, and promised to be careful. There was nothing unusual about the Mitchell household that evening. Chores had been done, dinner preparations were underway, and the quiet rhythm of farm life moved as it always did. Thomas Mitchell, who had moved the family from Jackson 5 years earlier to give his children more freedom, took comfort in the peacefulness of their land: rolling hills, pine forest, open fields, and a road close enough to feel connected, but far enough to feel safe. Sarah rode confidently, her route familiar, the narrow road bores, dared by pastures and lines of trees she had passed hundreds of times. Nothing along that stretch signaled danger, no parked vehicles, no commotion, just the stillness of a summer evening and the steady cadence of her bicycle wheels. Jennifer Walsh waited at Beaver Creek, expecting Sarah to appear with her usual energy and easy smile. But as the minutes stretched and the sun slipped further toward the horizon, the absence grew noticeable. At first, Jennifer assumed Sarah had been delayed at home. By 8:30 p.m., when Margaret Mitchell called the Walsh house to ask whether Sarah had arrived, the sense of unease sharpened into something heavier. What followed would unravel the fragile normalcy of that warm June day. Neighbors stepped outside, flashlights came on, voices called into the thickening dusk, and before the night was over, the first and only physical clue would surface just off the side of County Road 347, an object that didn't belong where it was found, resting in silence as the search for Sarah began. The blue Schwinn that carried her down the road would be discovered abandoned, and nothing about it would make sense. The first beams of flashlight and headlights swept across County Road 347 just before night fully settled, searching for any sign that Sarah Mitchell had simply taken a wrong turn or stopped along the way. The road was familiar to everyone in the area, narrow, quiet, bordered by pastures and a thin strip of soft earth. Nothing about it suggested danger. But when a pair of lights cut across the ditch running parallel to the asphalt, something metallic flashed back. Sarah's blue Schwinn bicycle lay on its side in the shallow ditch roughly 2 miles from the Mitchell farm and 1 mile short of Beaver Creek. The frame hadn't been twisted, bent, or forced into the ground. It appeared almost placed. Resting softly against the grass, the front wheel angled slightly as though it had come to a gentle stop rather than a violent one. Her small purse was still looped around the handlebars, untouched. Inside were the same ordinary items Margaret Mitchell had confirmed her daughter carried that day: $3 crumpled of weekly allowance and a tube of cherry lip gloss she'd bought that afternoon. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. The contents sat exactly as they would have if Sarah had continued on to Beaver Creek without interruption. There were no skid marks on the asphalt, no scrape in the dirt to indicate she had fallen, no torn fabric caught on the barbed wire fencing that ran along the edge of Miller's pasture, no sign of tire tracks veering off the road, no footprints suggesting panic or struggle. The ditch was quiet, too quiet for what should have been the site of movement, confusion, or resistance. Instead, it held only a bicycle that looked as if it had been set down by someone who did not intend to return. For investigators, that absence of evidence created the kind of void that becomes its own source of fear. This was not a scene that told a story, as one that erased one. Neighbors who had joined the early, informal search stepped back as word spread among the small group gathered there. Flashlights lowered. Conversations fell into uneasy whispers. Every instinct said a missing teenager should leave behind something recognizable, anything to suggest she had walked away or tried to signal for help. Instead, all they had was the bicycle and the silence pressing in from the fields. By the time Sheriff James Boyle arrived, the sun had disappeared completely. The beams of light made long, jittering shadows over the road as more volunteers reached the scene. Sarah's bicycle was carefully lifted from the ditch, examined and set aside, but its condition revealed nothing investigators could use. No broken chain, no loose bolts, no sign of mechanical trouble. What stood before them was not just a clue. It was a contradiction, a piece of evidence without context, a starting point that offered no direction. And as the night deepened, that contradiction propelled the community into what would become the largest search effort Hancock County had ever seen, a mobilization born from the hope that somewhere beyond this empty spot on the roadside, Sarah Mitchell might still be found. Night settled thick over Hancock County, the kind of Mississippi darkness that absorbs every distant sound and makes the pine forest feel endless. But on June 15, 1976, that darkness was broken by the sharp sweep of flashlights and the rising chorus of voices calling the same name again and again. Within hours of discovering Sarah Mitchell's abandoned bicycle, the search expanded from family and neighbors to an organized effort that would grow larger than anything the county had ever witnessed. By the end of the second day, nearly 300 volunteers had arrived, farmers still in their work clothes, church families carrying food and lanterns, off-duty firefighters, and residents who had never met the Mitchells but felt compelled to help. The Mitchell farm became the center of the operation. The quiet pasture land transformed into a crowded staging area lined with cars and trucks, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn fog. The Hancock County Volunteer Fire Department marked out search grids through the dense rows of pine, assigning teams to comb every direction. Voices carried across the woods from dawn until long past sunset, each call stretching a little thinner as time pulled forward. Margaret Mitchell moved through the scene with a photo of Sarah held tightly against her chest, a recent school picture she insisted each volunteer study before heading into the woods. Her movements were quick, focused, driven by a determination that left no room for rest. She spoke to every group that set out and every group that returned, refusing to pause even as exhaustion took hold. Thomas Mitchell spent his days in the field as well, working alongside volunteers with steady, methodical urgency. His knowledge of the terrain helped coordinators identify paths, creek bends, hunting trails, and areas dense with underbrush where visibility dropped to nothing. He pushed forward without hesitation, even as the hours stretched into days. Inside the Mitchells' barn, the community created a makeshift command center. Members of the local Methodist and Baptist churches set up tables for food and supplies, tending to volunteers who arrived muddy and drained. Radios crackled with updates. Maps were unrolled and marked. Every new report, no matter how small, was considered, logged, and dispatched toward teams already fading from fatigue. By the end of the week, federal authorities arrived. FBI Special Agent Robert Chen joined Sheriff James Boyle, bringing federal procedures that added structure and precision to the growing operation. Chen introduced detailed documentation, coordinated interviews, and ensured that every step taken from that point forward would hold up to scrutiny. His presence brought a mixture of relief and sobering realization. Cases that drew the FBI rarely ended cleanly. As days passed without progress, the optimism that had filled the early searches began to thin. Volunteers returned each morning with quieter voices, the weight of unanswered hours settling across the fields and woods. Yet still they came. Still they walked. Still they called Sarah's name into the dense Mississippi heat. Hancock County had never seen its people gather in such numbers or with such urgency, and as the search stretched from days into weeks, the sheer scale of the effort left a mark on the community, one that would linger long after the voices faded and the flashlights dimmed. The impact of that collective struggle and how deeply it reshaped the county's sense of safety would become clear in the weeks that followed. In the first days after Sarah Mitchell vanished, Hancock County moved with collective purpose. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the pine forests, church groups delivered meals, and neighbors who rarely crossed paths found themselves standing together, united in the same urgent hope. But as the days stretched into weeks, that unity began to shift into something heavier, an atmosphere shaped as much by fear as by determination. The emotional toll on the searchers became unmistakable. Early enthusiasm faded into a kind of grim persistence. Voices that once carried confidently across the woods grew quieter, strained by fatigue and by the reality that each day ended the same way, with no new information to bring back to the Mitchell family. Some volunteers began to move more slowly, their steps marked by the weight of uncertainty rather than the energy of initial resolve. Across the county, routines changed. Families who had once left doors unlocked began checking latches twice. Parents who had encouraged their children to explore the rural roads and creeks found themselves issuing new restrictions, not out of panic, but out of a grounded awareness that something unthinkable had happened in a place where danger had never been expected. Residents talked quietly in grocery stores and church parking lots, trying to reconcile their understanding of the community with the silence surrounding Sarah's disappearance. The areas near County Road 347 and Beaver Creek, once viewed simply as part of the landscape, took on a different meaning. The road where Sarah last pedaled and the ditch where her bicycle was found became symbols of vulnerability, ordinary places now tied to an event that had unsettled the entire community. Even those who had not known the Mitchell family personally felt the unease that came with having no explanation, no suspect, and no trace beyond a single abandoned bicycle. Search teams continued to move through the woods, but the expressions of those returning to the temporary command center reflected an evolving emotional landscape. Determination remained, but it was threaded with frustration, exhaustion, and the dawning recognition that the outcome might not align with the hope that had fueled the earliest efforts. Volunteers wrestled with the possibility of coming back empty-handed each night, a reality that deepened the communal sense of strain. What had begun as unity became shared trauma. Residents who had once greeted each other casually found new conversations dominated by the same question. How could a teenage girl disappear so completely along a familiar road in broad early evening light? That question lingered in living rooms, at dinner tables, and among search teams who continued working despite the diminishing likelihood of answers. The search altered Hancock County, leaving behind a community newly aware of the limits of its own safety. The disappearance had become more than a singular event. It reshaped how residents understood the place they lived, a place now marked by unanswered questions. And as investigators began to confront the narrowing possibilities and the fading momentum of the search itself, attention turned to the physical evidence collected in those early days. Evidence that would soon reveal the constraints of the era's forensic capabilities. In the days following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, every item collected, every photograph taken, and every measurement recorded became part of a growing archive investigators hoped would offer direction. Those cardboard boxes, neatly labeled, lined with reports, and filled with carefully preserved samples, were meant to hold answers. Instead, they became a record of how early limitations would restrain the investigation for decades. The first challenge surfaced at the bicycle. By the time Sheriff James Boyle's team arrived, well-meaning volunteers had already crowded the ditch along County Road 347. Footprints overlapped in the soft earth. Tire tracks from rescue vehicles cut across the asphalt, and the bicycle itself had been moved multiple times. The original position, critical for reconstructing events, was lost before it could be photographed. When investigators dusted the Schwinn, the results offered little. No fingerprints beyond those of Sarah's family and friends appeared. The handlebars and frame held only the smudges expected on a bicycle regularly used by a teenager. Nothing on the purse, still hanging from the handlebars, revealed outside contact. Inside, the $3 bills and tube of cherry lip gloss looked untouched. Blood found on a piece of broken glass near the site went through the available testing of the era. basic blood typing. The results eliminated certain individuals but could not identify anyone. The technology to extract unique genetic profiles simply did not exist in 1976. As far as the investigation was concerned, the sample provided a category, not a suspect. FBI Special Agent Robert Chen supervised the collection of soil samples, fabric fibers, and trace materials from the scene. The items were packaged according to the standards of the time, carefully labeled, photographed, and sealed. But those meticulous efforts were limited by technology. The fibers recovered from Sarah's bicycle yielded no meaningful information. Hair samples were analyzed only for color and texture, and soil samples could not be matched with precision. What investigators held were fragments without the tools to interpret them. Witness interviews added another layer of difficulty. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes remained firm on her 6:23 p.m. sighting of Sarah pedaling down County Road 347. But 3 additional witnesses reported seeing someone matching Sarah's description at other times or locations, statements that conflicted with one another and with the known timeline. One traveling salesman recalled a similar-looking girl near a dark pickup truck, but later admitted he had confused the date. When examined, the account belonged to a different day entirely. What the investigation accumulated was not a lack of effort, but a collection of materials that could not be used to narrow possibilities. Fingerprint analysis required weeks, only to return inconclusive results. Photographs taken on black and white film captured the scene but missed the subtle color variations that might have offered additional clues. Storage limitations meant some evidence was kept in improvised containers, risking degradation long before modern forensic techniques existed to extract meaning from them. Each physical clue, once logged and boxed, became another reminder of how far investigative tools still had to go. And as those boxes filled shelves in the courthouse basement, investigators turned their attention to the next available path, identifying potential suspects whose names seemed, at least briefly, to hold the promise of answers. In the months that followed Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, investigators pursued every lead with urgency, hoping that one credible suspect might bring an end to the uncertainty tightening around Hancock County. But each name that rose to the surface soon unraveled under examination, leaving behind only deeper frustration and a widening sense that the truth might stay just beyond reach. The first significant lead emerged in the summer of 1977, when a drifter named Carl Jamison was arrested for vagrancy in nearby Stone County. His inconsistent statements and his apparent familiarity with the area surrounding the Mitchell farm drew immediate attention. During questioning, Jamison shifted his story multiple times, at one point claiming he had been in Alabama on June 15, 1976, before later admitting he had camped within 5 miles of County Road 347 during that period. But what initially looked promising collapsed quickly once investigators examined his timeline. Medical records from the Stone County Health Department's mobile clinic confirmed that on the day Sarah vanished, Jamison had been treated near Hattiesburg for severe poison ivy exposure, a condition requiring follow-up care that kept him under supervision for days. The attending nurse remembered him clearly. The distance and the documented treatment eliminated him completely. Next came Danny Morrison, a 24-year-old family friend who occasionally worked on the Mitchell farm. Some community members had noted comments he made about young women, remarks that, under the pressure of a missing person investigation, raised concern. His proximity to the family and his behavior placed him under scrutiny. But Morrison's movements on the evening of June 15th were well accounted for. Multiple witnesses confirmed he had spent the night drinking at Murphy's Tavern, where a loud argument during a pool game made him memorable. He to several patrons. The bartender arranged for a relative to drive him home around 9:00 p.m., after the time Sarah's disappearance was discovered. Morrison also completed a polygraph examination, which showed no indication of deception when he denied involvement. The suspicion faded, leaving investigators without new direction. The most painful dead end involved the teenagers at Beaver Creek, including Sarah's closest friend, Jennifer Walsh. They were the last people she intended to meet that evening, placing them under unavoidable scrutiny. Interviews that were meant to clarify the timeline instead added strain. The repeated questioning and the possibility however remote, that any of them might have seen or heard something critical put heavy emotional pressure on adolescents already shaken by their friend's disappearance. Ultimately, none of the teens provided information that advanced the case, and none were found to be connected in any way. By early 1978, investigators had exhausted every lead that rose to the surface. Witnesses conflicted, physical evidence revealed nothing, and each suspect who seemed plausible was eventually ruled out with documentation or corroboration. The reports filled shelves, thick with information but thin on answers. The momentum that once fueled long days and urgent strategy meetings began to slow. And as investigators stepped back to reassess what remained, it became clear that without new evidence or an unforeseen break, the case that had mobilized an entire county was steadily slipping toward the fate no one wanted to acknowledge, becoming cold. The next turning point would not come from law enforcement at all, but from a mother who refused to let the passage of time dictate her daughter's fate. The rain came down steadily that March morning, tapping against the windows of the Mitchell farmhouse in a slow, persistent rhythm. Inside the kitchen, the same room where Sarah had eaten breakfast just days before her disappearance, Sheriff James Boyle sat across from Margaret Mitchell. His hat rested on the table beside him, the brim damp from the storm. Boyle looked older than he had the previous summer, worn down by months of unanswered questions and investigative paths that led nowhere. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every failed lead. He explained what the evidence had already made clear. The search had reached its practical limits. The interviews, the grid searches, the forensic testing, everything available to the department had been used. Despite the effort, despite the hope that had fueled long days and sleepless nights, no new information had emerged. The case was not being closed, he told her, but the pace could no longer be sustained. Active pursuit had become stagnation. Margaret listened in stillness, her hands resting on the table, her posture rigid. She absorbed each word without interruption, but something in her expression shifted. The sheriff's conclusion did not land as acceptance. It landed as a boundary she refused to recognize. When Boyle finished, Margaret thanked him with calm civility, but her eyes revealed a decision forming quietly behind the exhaustion. After he left, Margaret stood in the same kitchen and allowed the silence to settle. What had once been the center of the community's search effort now held only the echoes of radio updates, maps spread across the table, and volunteers filing in and out with new information. The whirlwind that had filled the summer and fall had diminished into a quiet void, but for Margaret, the end of official momentum marked the beginning of something else, an internal shift toward action she would undertake on her own terms. That afternoon she drove into town and purchased a simple composition notebook. The cover bore no significance, but the pages inside would become the starting point of a personal archive that would eventually fill an entire room. She began by writing down every detail she remembered from those first days: conversations, sightings, weather, and timelines. Her entries were careful, organized, and determined. The search moved from a public effort to a private mission. Margaret spoke with neighbors who had been hesitant to approach law enforcement. She documented unusual vehicles spotted near the farm. She created timelines that cross-referenced the information she had gathered. Each entry was written with deliberate precision, driven by a conviction that the truth was still reachable, even if official channels had run dry. Thomas supported her quietly, understanding the force behind her resolve, but unable to ease the toll it took. By the end of that spring, what had started as a collection of notes had expanded into a system: maps, letters, records, and photographs, carefully preserved and reviewed again and again. The investigation had shifted from law enforcement's hands into those of a mother unwilling to let her daughter slip into the margins of an unsolved file. And it was this transformation, quiet, methodical, and unwavering, that would shape the next 3 decades, turning Margaret Mitchell into the driving force behind a case that everyone else believed had reached its end. The first composition notebook lay open on the kitchen table, its pages empty except for the date Margaret Mitchell wrote carefully at the top. She could not have known that this single notebook would grow into an archive spanning 3 decades, An investigation carried out not by law enforcement, but by a mother unwilling to surrender her daughter to the silence that had settled over Hancock County. Margaret began by documenting everything she could recall about the first days of the search. Her handwriting, neat, even, steady, filled the pages with notes on sightings, conversations, and weather patterns. She sketched rough maps of County Road 347, marked where volunteers had walked, and wrote down the names of people who had come forward with information, but hesitated to speak publicly. Her work grew quickly. The kitchen, once the center of family life, transformed into a command post. Maps overlapped across the table, corners weighted with jars or folded beneath stacks of correspondence. Margaret wrote letters to law enforcement agencies across Mississippi and neighboring states, seeking advice or new perspectives. She subscribed to criminal justice publications, reading them late at night to understand investigative methods far beyond what rural departments had employed in 1976. When the initial notebooks filled, she bought more, dozens over the years, each one labeled and dated. Together, they formed a chronological record that rivaled the official case file. Margaret included copies of every police report and photograph she obtained, preserving them in a way that mirrored formal evidence handling. She tracked down private investigators when the family's finances allowed, hiring them to re-examine leads or interview people she believed had been overlooked. Each time one of them concluded their review without new answers, the report went into the growing stack. But the effort came with consequences. The financial strain deepened as the Mitchells borrowed against farm equipment and future crops to pay for investigative help. Thomas supported his wife's mission, though he watched with quiet concern as the work consumed her. Their marriage absorbed the weight of long nights, endless correspondences, and the slow erosion of hope. Neither spoke of stepping back. Both simply carried the burden in different ways. As months stretched into years, the attic above the farmhouse evolved into a space that held more than stored belongings. Margaret carried boxes upstairs one at a time: Sarah's school papers, clothing, childhood drawings, and personal possessions. These items held no official investigative value, but they grounded Margaret in the reality of who she was fighting for. The attic became a private shrine to her daughter's life and to the search that refused to end. The community, once unified in their support, began to step back. Sympathy remained, but distance grew as neighbors found it harder to engage with the relentless pursuit that defined Margaret's days. People offered kind words, meals, or help where they could, but grief that stretches across decades becomes difficult for others to carry. Margaret understood this, even as the circle around her slowly tightened. Still, she continued. Every lead, solid or shaky, was documented, reviewed, and preserved. Every unanswered question was written down in the hope it might someday find resolution. Her work kept the case alive through years when official interest had faded. And though she could not know it, her meticulous records and unwavering persistence would one day become the foundation for a modern detective's fresh eyes, a turning point that would bring the case back into the light after more than 40 years. When Detective Lisa Romano transferred to the Hancock County Sheriff's Office in January 2019, she carried with her a background steeped in forensic science and years spent working cases in Jackson. She had joined the department intending to apply modern investigative tools to long-dormant files, cases that had slipped into the quiet corners of storage rooms and basements. Among those files was the disappearance of Sarah Mitchell, now more than 40 years old. Romano approached the cold case backlog with methodical discipline. She began by conducting a full inventory of every item related to each unsolved investigation, pulling out boxes marked with faded ink, some stacked so long they left impressions in the shelving. When she reached the boxes tied to Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, she noticed inconsistencies between what was documented in the original evidence logs and what remained on the shelves. 3 boxes were accounted for. A 4th was listed, but missing. She didn't assume it was gone. Instead, she traced the history of the courthouse storage rooms, noting when materials had been relocated due to renovations or space shortages. Her search took her through back rooms and mislabeled shelves, each step driven not by expectation but by diligence. Eventually, tucked behind unrelated case files, she found a cardboard box whose label had faded almost to illegibility. The number on the corner matched the entry from the 1976 inventory. Inside were items collected by FBI Special Agent Robert Chen during the original investigation. Trace evidence, fabric fibers, soil samples, and other materials handled with federal-level precision. These items had been preserved according to the best protocols available in 1976, sealed carefully, protected from contamination, and maintained in climate-controlled conditions throughout the courthouse's various storage moves decades. Earlier, local investigators had lacked the technology to analyze them. Now, in Romano's hands, they represented an opportunity that had never existed before. She photographed the condition of every envelope, tube, and sample container before cataloging the contents. One envelope held fibers recovered from the handlebars of Sarah's bicycle. Another contained soil gathered from the site where the Schwinn had been found. The items inside were thin, barely visible sometimes, but they had been maintained with a level of care that preserved their potential value. The misfiling that had buried the box for more than 40 years had, by accident, protected it from unnecessary handling. Romano cross-referenced the rediscovered materials with the original FBI documentation. The precision in Chen's notes, measurements, scene details, photographic evidence, provided a foundation she could now build upon using tools unavailable to investigators in 1976. The realization was not dramatic. It was measured, steady, the kind of moment where possibility emerges quietly rather than explosively. The evidence had been waiting for the right conditions, the right technology, and the right person to reevaluate it. She prepared each item for submission to the Mississippi State Crime Laboratory, ensuring chain of custody integrity and verifying that every sample met current standards for forensic testing. The next phase would require patience. Modern DNA extraction could take months, especially with degraded or microscopic materials. But Romano understood the significance of finally being able to ask questions the original investigators never had the tools to attempt. And as she sealed the evidence for transport, one thought became clear. The science that once failed to illuminate the truth would now have the chance to speak. The case was shifting, from a file preserved in boxes to one reawakened by the possibilities of modern forensic analysis. The evidence box that had gone untouched for more than 4 decades arrived at the Mississippi State Crime Laboratory with a weight far greater than its size. Inside were fibers, soil samples, and trace biological materials collected in 1976, items investigators had preserved with care, but could not analyze meaningfully at the time. Now, under modern conditions, even degraded fragments could carry information once impossible to detect. Technicians approached the samples with protocols designed for age and fragility. Fabric fibers from Sarah Mitchell's bicycle were processed using amplification techniques that did not exist when the case first unfolded. These methods allowed the lab to extract partial DNA profiles from microscopic biological traces embedded in the material. Tiny, incomplete sequences, but remarkable given their age. Romano watched the results come in over several weeks. Each report added another piece to a puzzle that had stayed idle for far too long. The DNA profiles were not full genetic maps. They were partial, degraded, and limited by the technology of the moment. But even so, they represented something the investigation had never possessed before. A biological link to the person who had been in contact with Sarah's bicycle. The profiles contained enough usable markers to be entered into modern databases, though no direct match appeared. That outcome was not unexpected. Many individuals who lived in rural Mississippi in the 1970s had never submitted DNA samples, and those who might have shared genetic similarity were not necessarily represented in law enforcement systems. Still, the significance of the findings was unmistakable. For the first time since 1976, investigators had a biological signature belonging to the unknown individual who had interacted with the bicycle. It was the first genuine lead in decades, a lead grounded not in witness memory, rumor, or circumstantial timelines, but in scientific data. Romano studied the lab's breakdown of the genetic material, reviewing the markers that could be compared against broader genealogical databases. She understood immediately what this meant. Partial profiles, especially in cold cases, often served as starting points for advanced techniques rather than conclusions themselves. And with the growth of consumer DNA services and genealogical repositories, even a fragment could open a path that standard law enforcement databases could not. The transition from forensic analysis to investigative application required precision. Romano cataloged every detail, ensuring the chain of custody remained intact and the documentation supported the next steps. The science had done what 1970s tools could not. It produced information that could be compared and expanded upon. As she organized the reports on her desk, Romano reflected on the unusual arc of the investigation. Decades earlier, the same evidence had been stored away with no ability to reveal what it held. Now the technological divide between eras had transformed those once silent fibers into a voice, quiet, incomplete, but unmistakably present. The question before her was no longer whether the DNA could help, but how far modern investigative methods could take it. And the answer lay in a field that merged biology with lineage, statistics with family history, a field that had begun solving cases once thought unsolvable. Romano's next step would introduce the investigation to genetic genealogy, a tool capable of tracing identity through generations when direct matches could not be found. The partial DNA profiles extracted from decades-old fibers opened the door to a method of investigation that hadn't existed when Sarah Mitchell vanished in 1976. With no direct match in law enforcement databases, the next step required a different kind of expertise, one that blended biology, statistics, and family lineage. Detective Lisa Romano partnered with genetic genealogist Dr. Sarah Chen, whose experience solving cold cases through genealogical mapping had already proven the power of this emerging field. The DNA samples were uploaded to Family Tree DNA and GED Match, databases containing profiles submitted voluntarily by individuals seeking to learn more about their ancestry. These platforms allowed investigators to identify people who shared segments of DNA with the unknown contributor from the crime scene evidence. The initial results included distant connections across thousands of individuals, but most were too remote to be meaningful. Then a significant match appeared, a third cousin-level connection with a woman named Patricia Sullivan Weber. According to Chen's analysis, Patricia and the unknown profile shared a common ancestor approximately 4 generations back. That lone connection provided a stable foothold, anchoring the investigation to a single family line with deep roots in Mississippi. Chen began constructing a family tree, starting with Patrick and Bridget Sullivan, the couple whose descendants branched across the Southeast following their settlement in Mississippi after the Civil War. The lineage contained dozens of potential male relatives who might have been the right age in 1976. Each branch required careful scrutiny. Birth records, residential patterns, and historical context helped narrow the possibilities. Romano supported Chen's work by traveling across Mississippi and neighboring states to conduct discreet surveillance and collect discard DNA samples from living male descendants of the Sullivan family. Items like cigarette butts and coffee cups provided comparison material without direct confrontation, avoiding unnecessary alarm while maintaining legal evidentiary standards. As the months progressed, the list of potential suspects shrank. Some descendants were eliminated due to their ages at the time of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. Others lived far from Hancock County in 1976, with employment or military records confirming their locations. Through steady elimination, the branches of the family tree tapered until only a few remained. Then Chen uncovered a detail that shifted the investigation. One branch of the Sullivan family had never left Hancock County. Their proximity to the Mitchell farm in 1976 placed them squarely within the geographic center of the case. Among them was Robert Eugene Sullivan, who had been 19 years old at the time of Sarah's disappearance and living with his parents just 3 miles from the Mitchell property. His name had never appeared in the 1976 investigation files. There was no record of interviews, no notes referencing him, no indication that anyone had considered him a person of interest. But the genealogical narrowing made his position unmistakable. He fit the age profile, lived in the right location, and belonged to the Sullivan branch genetically connected to the crime scene DNA. Romano and Chen reviewed the remaining possibilities one last time, confirming that no other descendants aligned as closely with the evidence. The path of elimination pointed consistently in one direction, toward Robert Sullivan. The next phase would move out of databases and family charts and into the field, surveillance, routine tracking, and the search for a discarded item that could confirm with certainty whether the decades-old DNA belonged to him. Robert Eugene Sullivan lived the kind of life that rarely drew attention. His days followed a predictable rhythm, steady, quiet, unremarkable. For Detective Lisa Romano, that predictability became an anchor. Surveillance on a man who blended seamlessly into his surroundings required patience. But Sullivan's routines offered structure to an investigation that had already stretched across decades. Each Tuesday morning, just after sunrise, Sullivan followed the same pattern. He drove to a small convenience store, bought coffee and a lottery ticket, exchanged a few polite words with the clerk, and returned to his modest trailer home outside Meridian. It was a habit Romano observed repeatedly, noting the lack of variation. Routine, consistent, dependable, qualities that made surveillance easier and, in an unsettling way, more revealing. Romano maintained distance, careful not to disrupt the rhythm that allowed her team to track him without detection. They monitored his movements quietly. Short walks along rural roads, occasional errands, evenings spent alone. Nothing in his demeanor suggested agitation or suspicion. Yet each observation reinforced an uneasy truth. This man, who moved through the world with unremarkable steadiness, matched the genealogical profile more closely than anyone else. The key moment came during one of those Tuesday routines. After Sullivan exited the convenience store with his coffee, he paused near a trash bin, finished the last sip, and tossed the disposable cup inside. It was a simple gesture, repeated countless times over the years. But for investigators watching from a distance, it marked a turning point. Once Sullivan drove away, Romano's team retrieved the discarded cup, following strict protocols to maintain chain of custody and avoid contamination. The cup was packaged immediately and sent for DNA analysis. Evidence collected legally, left behind by Sullivan himself in a public space. When the laboratory results arrived, the conclusion was clear. The DNA extracted from the coffee cup matched the partial profiles obtained from the trace evidence on Sarah Mitchell's bicycle. The statistical certainty met the required legal thresholds, leaving no ambiguity. After more than 43 years of questions, investigators had a biological confirmation linking Robert Sullivan to the case. For Romano, the weight of the match was immediate. It wasn't just the scientific result, it was the geography. Sullivan had lived only miles from the Mitchell farm in 1976, within the same rural stretch where Sarah rode her bicycle on the evening she disappeared. His proximity, once an unexamined detail lost in the vastness of a decades-old file, now carried profound implications. She reviewed the findings repeatedly, ensuring each step aligned with evidentiary standards. The genealogical narrowing, the surveillance, the discarded DNA, the lab confirmation, all threads converged on the same person. And with that convergence, investigators had the first definitive identification in a case that had haunted Hancock County for nearly half a century. The next step was unavoidable. After weeks of surveillance and years of investigative stagnation, law enforcement prepared to confront Robert Sullivan directly. And as dawn approached on a cold January morning, the operation to arrest him began, setting the stage for the moment when decades of silence would finally be broken inside an interrogation room. Robert Eugene Sullivan sat in the interrogation room with his hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture calm, almost resigned. There was no agitation, no defensiveness, no attempt to distance himself from the situation unfolding around him. Detective Lisa Romano began with routine background questions, setting a baseline as she had done many times before. Sullivan answered each one quietly and directly, offering information about his work history, family, and daily habits without hesitation. Nothing in his demeanor suggested resistance. If anything, he appeared relieved to be there, as though the weight he had carried for nearly 50 years had made this moment inevitable. Romano watched him closely, noting how his voice remained steady until she reached for a single item in the case file. She slid a photograph across the table, a school portrait of 16-year-old Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, taken just weeks before her disappearance. The effect was immediate. Sullivan's face collapsed into grief, his shoulders drawing inward as tears filled his eyes. He stared at the image with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, quieter. The transformation required no interpretation. It was visible, direct, and unguarded. For several minutes he couldn't speak. Romano remained silent, giving him space as the emotion overtook him. When he finally managed to form words, his voice had thinned to a whisper. His first question was not about his arrest, the evidence, or the charges pending against him. He asked whether Margaret Mitchell was still alive. When Romano informed him that Sarah's mother had died in 2008, his composure broke completely. The grief that surfaced in that moment was plain and uncontrolled, rooted in the decades he had lived with the knowledge of what had happened on June 15, 1976. What followed was a confession delivered in fragments, interrupted by long silences and unsteady breaths. Sullivan described a moment that began with an approach and escalated beyond anything he had intended. He told Romano that when Sarah tried to flee from his unwanted advance, panic overtook him, and the situation spiraled into violence he had not planned. His account was not offered as justification, simply as explanation, shaped by years of remorse that had never found an outlet. When Romano asked where Sarah had been buried, Sullivan provided the location through tears and halting directions. The information brought investigators to the place he described, ending the decades-long uncertainty that had shadowed the Mitchell family. His confession aligned with the evidence, the genealogical conclusions, and the DNA match recovered from his discarded coffee cup. By the time the interview concluded, the room felt suspended in quiet. Sullivan had not requested an attorney. He had not contested the evidence. He had simply released what he had carried since he was 19, a truth withheld through nearly 5 decades of silence. As investigators prepared for the next stage, the focus shifted from confession to consequence. The legal process, long delayed by the absence of a suspect, could finally begin, bringing the case into a courtroom that had waited almost half a century for resolution. The old Hancock County courthouse had not held a crowd like this in decades. People who had once carried flashlights through pine forest in the summer heat now filled the wooden benches, older faces marked by time but united by the memory of the search that had bound them together in 1976. The atmosphere was quiet, not out of formality, but out of the gravity that settled over the room as Robert Eugene Sullivan was brought forward for sentencing. Sullivan entered frail, subdued, his posture bent under a weight that had accumulated over nearly half a century. He had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a decision that spared Hancock County the emotional strain of a full trial. Yet his appearance still forced the community to confront the unsettling truth that the man responsible had lived among them for decades, working jobs, exchanging small talk, helping neighbors with yard work, passing by the very roads where his crime had occurred. Among those watching the proceedings was Jennifer Walsh, Sarah Mitchell's childhood friend. Now living in Mobile, she had received the call about the arrest while preparing dinner for her grandchildren. The news had brought her to her knees, grief and relief merging in a way she hadn't experienced since she was 16. In the courtroom, the weight of that moment lingered visibly. Also present was Thomas Mitchell, now 83 and living in a nursing home in Biloxi. The revelation that his daughter's killer had been someone he knew, a young man who had occasionally helped with farm work, someone who had attended the same church where the family had prayed for Sarah's return, brought a fresh layer of sorrow. The sense of betrayal settled heavily upon him, reshaping memories that had already carried decades of pain. Sarah's younger brother, Michael Mitchell, sat quietly with his hands clasped. He had been 12 when Sarah vanished and had long accepted that the case would never be solved. The confirmation that her killer had lived freely during the years his family had mourned left him grappling with a renewed surge of anger, sharp, unexpected, and difficult to place. When Sullivan addressed the court, his voice trembled. He expressed remorse, but even genuine sorrow felt insufficient when measured against decades of uncertainty endured by the Mitchell family and the community. His words could not restore what was taken, nor could they soften the reality that he had lived an entire adult life beyond the reach of accountability. Judge Raymond Foster delivered a sentence of 25 years in prison. For some, the punishment felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of the crime. For others, it raised questions about the purpose of incarcerating a 67-year-old man who might not survive a longer term. The courtroom carried an undercurrent of conflicting emotions, resolution mixed with discomfort, justice intertwined with the awareness of how much time had passed. When the hearing ended and the benches emptied, a collective silence followed. The case that had shaped Hancock County for nearly 50 years finally had a conclusion, but not the kind that erased the ache of what had been lost. Instead, it left behind a reflection on the fragility of safety, the endurance of grief, and the power of persistence carried by a community and a mother who refused to let Sarah be forgotten. And as residents stepped back into the Mississippi light, the story of June 1976 remained with them, no longer an open question, but a reminder of how long justice can take to find its way home.